Good evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online. Tonight, we're going to be hosting Barry Meier. He'll be talking about his new book, Spooked, the Trump Dossier, Black Cube, and the Rise of Private Spies with Michael Isikoff. I'm Ariel Zeitlin. I'm one of the librarians at Montclair Public Library. And first, I'd just like to tell you about the Q&A button. So the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a computer or a smartphone, it's at the top of your screen if you're using a tablet. You use the Q&A button not just to ask questions after the live conversation takes place, but also in case you have a tech question, you can turn to my librarian co-host, Selwa Shami. And now I'd like to introduce Jared Everett Miller, one of the members of the board of our Library Foundation. Welcome, Jared.
Thanks, Ariel. I appreciate it. We're so happy you're here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money to fund the offerings that make our library so special. This includes library programs like this one, staff development, building restoration, and other needs that aren't covered by city funding. Your donations support everything from laptop lending and Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access, to delivery of materials to seniors who are at home, to children's reading programs, and most recently, the significant growth in e-content during the pandemic. So please make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org. After you enjoy this event, gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever, particularly if you've been following the funding situation in Montclair. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the program.
Thanks so much, Jared, for all that you do. And for all of you in the audience, if you're looking for another way to pitch in, you can look for Friends of the Library of the Montclair Public Library on our website or on our Facebook page. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our guest of honor, Barry Meier. So Barry was an investigative reporter at the New York Times for almost 30 years. He was a member of the team that won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. He's also a two-time winner of the George Polk Award in journalism. Among his other accomplishments, Barry was key in breaking the OxyContin story. He's published two other books, Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic, and Missing Man, the American Spy Who Vanished in Iran. He lives in New York. Welcome, Barry.
Good evening, Ariel. Thanks so much for having me on here. I really appreciate it.
Barry's latest book, Spooked, about the rise of private spies, just came out a few days ago. You can borrow it through the library or buy it from our program partner, Watch On Booksellers in Montclair. And now I'm also very happy to introduce Barry's conversation partner, Michael Isikoff. Mike is the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, where he explores national security, money and politics, and so much more. Previously, he was an investigative correspondent for NBC, as well as a staff writer for Newsweek and the Washington Post. Isikoff has written or co-written 3 New York Times bestsellers, most recently, Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. He lives in the Washington, D.C. area. Welcome, Mike.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so this is the moment you've all been waiting for. I'll be back after our audience Q&A. And for all of you at home, please remember you can start submitting your questions while the conversation is going on. Thanks so much and enjoy.
Well, Barry, let's get started. Good to talk to you. I'd like to start out. You've written about so many different things: cult groups, the opioid crisis, much, much more. What drew you to this particular subject of the private spy industry?
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Mike, for taking part in this. It really happened when I was leaving the Times at the end of 2017, early 2018. There were several stories that were exploding at that time. One was the dossier, the other was the Harvey Weinstein story, and another big scandal involving Theranos, the medical testing company, had also just unfolded. And the thread I realized that pulled all these stories together were private spies. I mean, throughout all of these stories, private spies have been hired to dig up dirt and investigate people. And I thought, wow, there's this whole huge industry out there that most people don't know about. So I decided, let's flip the script, and why don't I investigate the people who make a living investigating the rest of us.
So let's talk a little bit about how you're defining spies. Because, obviously in the popular vernacular, we all have images of what we think of when we hear the word spies. There are all sorts of firms that offer a whole bunch of services, including, culling public records and looking in, courthouses for, old documents, all sorts of things. Who is a spy, and what is it they do that you found to be questionable?
Well, in the general sense, I would think everyone in this industry tends to call themselves corporate investigators or private intelligence investigators, which is a fine term to use. But when you sort of burrow down into many of their activities, they have contractors, they have other people that actually do spying for them, or that seek information by taking on pretexts. For example, Black Cube, the Israeli company that worked for Harvey Weinstein, they would create online digital disguises for their operatives who would approach people under pretext. To me, that's a spy. Christopher Steele, former spy, hired an operative who went to Russia to gather dirt about Donald Trump. He's a spy. So whether companies think of themselves as spies, describe themselves as spies, more often than not, somewhere along the line, they're drawing on information gathered by people who really fit the broad definition of a spy.
So, clearly when one engages in deception, like Black Cube did, that is crossing a line that you and I wouldn't cross as journalists, right? So let's, obviously your book is already controversial because of your discussion of the Trump Dossier and Fusion GPS, and we'll get into that. But let's start out with sort of the easy pickings of Black Cube and what it did on behalf of Harvey Weinstein. Now, a lot of this was reported by your colleagues at the Times at the time, but tell us what you found out about how Black Cube did its business that fits into your narrative.
Well, the extraordinary thing about Black Cube is they created this mystique. They created the mystique that they were ex-Mossad agents who were, kind of the princes of stealth. When in fact, what you start discovering is when you start digging into Black Cube is that they're essentially running a fairly sophisticated clown show. I mean, they are running the oldest con in the book, which is to sucker people into thinking you're someone you're not, and then con them out of information. But they weren't the only ones who were using those tactics. I mean, there's a very well-known corporate intelligence firm called K2 Intelligence, which was founded by Jules Kroll, who created the corporate investigation industries back in the 1970s. Well, these folks hold themselves up as, ethical investigators, but their London office just a couple of years ago sent a operative out who pretended to be a documentary filmmaker in order to infiltrate public health activists who were campaigning to stop the use of asbestos in the third world. And it turns out that K2 Intelligence client was someone who had a financial interest in the asbestos industry. So, these companies like Black Cube, they go, oh, okay, there's Black Cube. But the guys who put on like nice suits and ties and declare themselves to be, top-rate corporate investigators, their firms can pull off the same shenanigans as well.
Right. There's another Israeli company that you write about, the NSO Group, that does some pretty creepy stuff. And there are pretty strong indications that these are veterans of Israeli National Security Agent. I think it's Unit 8200, which is the Israeli version of the NSA, that developed spyware, computer spyware that can penetrate your phone. And there's reason to believe that it was marketed to the Saudis, and they used it to target one of the dissidents that Jamal Khashoggi was communicating with, and that this may well have led directly to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, that strikes me as, in some ways, even more sinister than the deceptive tactics that Black Cube was using.
There are many sinister things, and certainly what this company PsyOps would claim. Well, we just give our technology to law enforcement or government agencies. But one of the things that I try to document in the book is that this sort of spyware or other types of cyber spying devices have become so cheap and so available that you can, a guy can buy them off the shelf. You don't need like high-tech stuff to do this anymore. There are these devices that, they're called IMSI catchers. And basically, if I'm standing somewhere and an operative gets in between me and the cell tower, they can pick up everything I'm saying. They can pick up all my cell message, text messages. They can spy, they can surveil me in the same way that a program that is deposited. So, the use of hacking, of spyware, of surveillance devices has become rife in the private intelligence industry over the past decade.
Right. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Trump Dossier and the Fusion GPS. Clearly, that's the most controversial part of your book. And I want you to talk, look, this is a complicated discussion for, certainly for me, because I am an old friend of Glenn Simpson, known him for years, worked with him, partied with him, no question that he was, and he and I were pretty close over the years. And starting with the 2016 election and the rise of Donald Trump, there was an eagerness on the part of a lot of people, journalists, political operatives, the public at large, to learn as much about Donald Trump's background as we could. He was a potential president. Was there anything wrong on its face for a company like Fusion GPS to take up the job of trying to do research on Donald Trump's background as he was gaining traction as a presidential candidate?
I don't think so. I mean, what Fusion GPS was doing was, traditional political oppo, and you know that field pretty much better than anyone else, since
Certainly
you
something
wrote,
I've dealt with many times over
yeah,
the
you
years.
wrote the
Yes.
famous bimbo eruption stories during the Bill Clinton campaign, and identified that Bill Clinton's campaign had hired private detectives to gather dirt on the women that could potentially accuse him of having affairs. So this has been going on for a long time. There is nothing new about this. There's nothing really unusual about this. It happens on both sides of the political fence. And certainly when you had an individual like Donald Trump, who was bringing oodles and oodles of baggage with him as a candidate, it's not unusual for that to happen. Where things kind of like jump the fence, if you will, is in the spring of 2016, when Donald Trump becomes the presumptive Republican candidate, and Fusion begins working for the Democratic Party, for Hillary Clinton's campaign, and seeks the services of Christopher Steele, an ex-MI6 agent with connections to Russia, to gather dirt on Trump over there.
And okay, what you say, that's when things jumped the fence, but what was the line that was being crossed there?
Well, let me try to give you an analogy. When I wrote my book, Painkiller, about OxyContin, one of the things that jumped out at me was the fact that in the early 2000s, when the drug's maker, Purdue Pharma, was really pushing the drug, there were a lot of journalists that accepted Purdue's claims that there was all this scientific data that supported the safety and efficacy of OxyContin's use. I actually went and looked at those studies, and they didn't support it at all. So let's just jump forward to the Trump dossier. And so reporters were suddenly being presented with these reports or implications that there was evidence of collusion between Donald Trump, members of his campaign, and the Kremlin. And this was coming through, intelligence that had been gathered by, a collector for Christopher Steele in Russia. So where things jump the shark, if you will, is when reporters kind of jump to the conclusion without sort of examining, well, what's the real evidence of this? What can we find out on our own? And who's Christopher Steele? Who's his source? And really, who are these guys at Fusion GPS?
Right. Now, because I'm a part of the story at this point as well, I can tell you a little bit. You know this, but for our audience, in the spring of 2016, there were a lot of legitimate questions and reasons to be suspicious about what was going on between Trump and Russia. We knew by June of 2016 that the Russians had hacked the emails of the DNC. By July, we had a pretty good idea that they had supplied them to WikiLeaks, which released them on the eve of the Democratic convention, and that clearly this was going to hurt Hillary Clinton and benefit Donald Trump. And then you add on top of that, Paul Manafort is his campaign chairman, a guy who'd worked for the pro-Russian oligarch president of Ukraine for many years, was on his payroll. You will acknowledge there were a lot of reasons to be suspicious and want to know more, and want to know as much as we could about what Trump's connections were in Moscow.
I absolutely agree. I didn't really do much reporting on the campaign, But had I, those would be things I would be digging into the way reporters at my paper and other papers were doing. And all that is totally legitimate. And it's incredibly important to chase that information down so that the public is aware of the relationships of a person who's running for the highest job in the United States. But then we kind of jump from there, right? And I think you're probably aware of how that jump was made or where that jump occurred.
It was right in the middle of it, right?
Yes, you were.
Yeah.
And so we're now jumping from evidence that we can ascertain, things that we can find out, to things that we really don't know, and assumptions that we want to make.
Right.
Because they're very appealing assumptions to make.
Right. Right. Now, as you write in the book, I was one of the reporters who spoke to Christopher Steele during this time period, during the campaign. And, what he had to say at the time, this was all on background, of course, but what he had to say was quite alarming, right? I mean, he had some really serious allegations about collusion and the relationship and compromise and blackmail and all that. None of which, or very little of which, we could verify. On the other hand, we knew and established that he actually had been a source for the FBI over the years and the State Department. There were people in the US government that took him seriously. He had been with MI6 in Moscow. So he had the credentials of somebody who was knowledgeable in this space, right? Now, in my case, what made it newsworthy at the time was I learned that the FBI was taking this seriously and was actually investigating one of the people who Steele had identified as being in the middle of it, and that was this guy Carter Page. And I wrote a story about that the FBI that U.S. intelligence agencies were investigating this possible connection. Now, you talk a lot about the role of journalists in this. And, I've been questioned a lot about this, my own role. And, I've said, look, when I learned the FBI is doing a serious investigation or taking something seriously, and that it's coming from a source who was known to the US government, who provided reliable information in the past, that met my threshold. You think I was wrong?
I don't think you were necessarily wrong, Mike, but when I think about the people like yourself who met with Christopher Steele and were briefed by Christopher Steele, you're being presented with someone who has kind of the background that you described. He's a former MI6 spy. He worked in a senior position within MI6. He had a relationship with the FBI. He dressed well. He looked like a mensch. He had all the
mensch is not the word I use
whatever.
for Christopher Steele.
He looked like
a serious guy.
He looked like a serious guy.
And sounded like a serious guy.
Sounded like a serious guy. But let me turn your question around and ask it this way. If you were sitting in that room and, Christopher Steele was like a stacking doll, a nesting doll, and you took him off, and then inside you pulled out this guy, Igor Danchenko,
yes,
who was his collector.
Yes.
And you were presented with Igor Danchenko as a source of this information. I suspect that you and every other person that was sitting in that room would have walked out the door.
Well, I don't know that I would have walked out the door, but I certainly would have had a lot more questions. And I did over time, where was this stuff coming from?
Right.
And where, what was the basis for Steele's claims? which were quite.
And what was the basis for not only Steele's claims about Russia, but Steele's claims about himself? You noted in your book that he played like a critical role in the FBI investigation into the scandal at FIFA, the soccer organization.
Right.
Other people wrote about how he was critical to the solving of the poisoning of Litvinenko, the KBG agent, former KBG agent in Moscow.
KGB, yeah,
in mid 2000s. But I don't think, and you can tell me this, a lot of the people that wrote this stuff never said to themselves, I'm going to make some phone calls and check this out.
Yeah.
Who are the people that know about this stuff? What can they tell me about Christopher Steele's role in it? I decided to do that. And when I started to do that, it sort of became apparent that Christopher Steele's billing may have been a little exaggerated compared to what he actually did. I mean, he really had very little to do with the FIFA, the soccer investigation, other than setting up the reporter who had broken that story with the FBI. That was his major contribution. He certainly wasn't like a big player in it. As to what he did in solving the Litvinenko poisoning, that's anybody's guess. But I spoke to Litvinenko's best friend, who had never heard of Christopher Steele. I spoke to, and he told me that Litvinenko's wife had never heard of Christopher Steele. I spoke to two people who wrote books about the cases who had never heard of Christopher Steele, and Litvinenko's business partner never heard of Christopher Steele. So he either was an incredible creature of stealth, or he actually didn't do that much.
Or he was doing analytical work that wouldn't necessarily have put him in touch with the people you mentioned.
He wasn't like Inspector Clouseau that was solving a mystery.
Well, look, you had the advantage of time, because over time, the questions about the origins of this material and Steele's background and who his collector were became sort of more and more important to understanding. Well, it was always important to understanding the story, but there were more and more reasons to raise questions about the provenance of the material. But let's take let's take a step back here now from the advantage point of May 2021. What should we make of the Steele dossier?
Well, I think my conclusion may be pretty similar to yours, which is not much, because as you're aware, a lot of it hasn't been proven to be true. And critical parts of it, such as the allegation that Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's lawyer, met with Russian agents in Prague during the 2016 campaign, have been proven to be false. So, while Steele's assertion that there was going to be Russian interference in the election was true, that observation was by no means unique to him, and that the juice, if you will, that set the dossier apart, that made it unique, that made it appealing to reporters like you, kind of fell apart as time marched on.
And yet there was a period of time, starting with BuzzFeed's publication of the dossier, in which this thing got enormous press attention and became a political and cultural event, as it were.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that people forget is that prior to the dossier's publication by BuzzFeed, there were really only two stories written that kind of emanated out of Christopher Steele's work. One was yours and one was in Mother Jones. But when BuzzFeed, for God knows whatever reason, posted the dossier, it's like the gates were open, all hell broke loose, and the kind of, media rage machines that exist on both sides of the political spectrum had, fodder to last for the next 3 years.
Yeah. And, which is interesting because, your conclusions about the accuracy of Steele's allegations, which are not very much different than mine at this point, has led to your book being greeted by Trump loyalists and the conservative media outlets as a great journalistic achievement on your part, and while being pretty much ignored, at least so far, from other media. Now that can't make you happy that you're being embraced by the Federalist, and I understand, well, I'm going to ask you about this in a moment. You're scheduled to be on Tucker Carlson tomorrow night. Does it make you a little queasy to be embraced by people whose political views you probably don't share at all?
We don't control who appropriates our work. My only desire is to see my work represented accurately,
Right.
and to be given a forum to represent my views and my feelings accurately. Beyond that, I really have no control. Would I like people on CNN to talk about the book, to ask me questions about the book? Of course, I would love that. Would I, like more people in the mainstream media to talk about, well, what did we as journalists take away from this episode? How should this change how we behave as journalists?
So that's a really important and interesting question. What is the answer? What is your answer to that? What should we take away from this episode?
I think that we have an obligation to be transparent with readers or with viewers. There's this game that's gone on behind the curtains forever. There's a symbiotic relationship between journalists and private operatives. They both benefit from the situation. The private operatives feed journalists stories, feed them documents, and in turn, they get to see stories appear in the media that advance the interests of their client, often by damaging the reputation of their adversary. And I really do think that within, the rules that we have in journalism about, well, how do we source things? How do we attribute things? That it is very important to signal to the reader that information in this story is coming in part, or to some degree, from people who have an adverse interest to the subject of the story. That I, Barry Meier, or you, Michael Isikoff, didn't wake up one morning and think, God, Michael Cohen was in Moscow, was in Prague meeting with Russian agents, or God, there's a P-tape, or God, all this other stuff exists. And it doesn't just happen with the dossier, it happens all the time in journalism where people are fed stories. And I do think that at this stage of the game, we're right to give anonymity to whistleblowers, to people who put themselves on the line, to alert the public to dangers or scandals. But we're not dealing with whistleblowers when we're dealing with, private intelligence operatives. We're dealing with people who are paid to plant information. And I don't see any reason to give them special treatment.
Look, this is anybody in our line of work has wrestled with these issues for years. Very few sources are pure public spirited citizens who just want the truth to be known, almost inevitably, they have agendas. They have political interests, business interests, personal interests in, getting back at somebody who screwed them or didn't listen or read their memos or whatever. There's always some motive. But if they have information that we can verify and believe is of public interest, we want to know what that information is, right? I mean, and I should point out, I mean, I know you haven't read it, but Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch, the owners of Fusion GPS, have just posted a piece on Medium pointing out that you had reached out to them during the 2016 campaign for information that they had about Paul Manafort and other aspects of Trump's connections to Russia. So, their argument is, hey, come on, Meyer, you came to us, you wanted information from us. Why are you condemning, what we do when you wanted to rely on or not rely, or at least hear what and see what our information was?
As I noted in the book, there were times during the 2016 campaign that I interacted with Glenn Simpson. I'm not hiding that. I don't have any problem saying that, but I never used anything, to the best of my knowledge, that I learned from our interactions in any story that I wrote, nor did I know anything about the dossier until it was publicized.
But if he or some similar source had provided you with, say, documents that they had that related to something you were interested in, and said you can use this, but just don't say you got it from me, you probably would have accepted those terms, no?
I might have. I mean, I might have then. I might not now. I think, I've come away from this experience and watching what's happened to the media as a result of this, to think we really need to change our tune in order to retain the trust of the public. I mean, this episode has really damaged the media. And I know you and I revere journalism. It's a profession that we pursued, that we honor, and that we want to protect. And, one of the big tragedies of this case is that all the storm and drum over the dossier diverted journalists from pursuing the really bad stuff about Trump and his administration, and also gave them, Trump and his supporters, a cudgel that they could use to beat journalists that were trying to do their job. So, it's not just whether I, would accept documents, it's this episode produced damage. Are we going to learn from it and do things differently? Probably not. But I think in the end, it doesn't benefit journalism to not stop and say, how did we screw up? What can we learn from this? And what can we do differently going forward? I'm not contending I have the answer to that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask,
but
what
there should be
specifically should we as journalists do differently?
I think that's something that journalists need to talk about within their news organizations, that news organizations need to talk about among themselves. I mean, you had mentioned a little while ago, well, you're not going on MSNBC, you're not going on CNN. Well, in large part, that's true. And why is that, do you think?
Well, I think that, those outlets in particular had bought into the dossier and promoted it, far beyond the time that it probably deserved promotion. And then, like all of us, have been reluctant to acknowledge they might have screwed up, right? I mean, that's sort of in all our
and I have to
DNAs,
say, so the
right?
audience, it knows this, that, you know, to your credit, you were one of the journalists who spoke out, and you spoke out forcefully and early about it. And your quote, which I don't remember precisely, but something.
It's in the book.
Yeah, but something to the effect that, you know, we should have scrutinized this from the beginning.
Right.
And you were right. But you, unfortunately, are in the minority. Hopefully, over time, people will see it differently. But, you know, I don't control what news organizations do. I don't run news organizations. All I can do is write things, and maybe someone will say, that makes sense. Let me think about what to do the next time I get approached with something like this.
Right. So just two sort of final points on the whole, Trump Russia stuff. One comeback might be, yeah, maybe Steele got some particulars wrong. It was raw intelligence. Neither Glenn Simpson or Fritch or Steele himself ever said all of it was true. And in a large general sense, there were improper, untoward ties between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And, look at the disclosure just a few weeks ago by the Biden administration that Manafort had supplied sensitive polling data to this guy Kalimnik, who was a Russian intelligence asset, and possibly more. Isn't that a sort of vindication of at least the general point that Steele and Simpson were trying to make?
I don't think that anyone would have argued with the dossier if that's where they stopped the argument, that there was Russian interference. And I think they were not the only ones that believed that was taking place. However, they didn't leave it there. They came up with a number of highly salacious, inflammatory allegations that got the blood of folks like you and many other reporters boiling. I mean, in the book, I, go through how, harkening back to Michael Cohen's trip to Prague, how one of my former colleagues, Scott Shane, thought, oh my God, if this is true, it's the end game. There was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who went to Prague. I tell a very funny story about how he got sort of sashayed by some sort of female operative there who thought this is going to be the end game. And, it just took people down rabbit holes. It took people down dead ends. It made us miss the real action. If Steele was so good, if Glenn Simpson was so good, or Peter Fritch was so good, how come they didn't know about the most obvious conflict that was going on, which was that Michael Cohen was negotiating a business deal in Moscow on Donald Trump's behalf? So if you want to think about why Donald Trump was kowtowing to Moscow, well, money is a lot easier answer than some crazy conspiracy theory.
Right.
And,
yeah.
And if people, how come, if Christopher Steele was so good, how come he didn't pick up on that? How come neither Christopher Steele, Glenn, or Peter picked up on the Trump Tower meeting when Glenn was working with the Russian lawyer who went there to meet with Donald Trump Jr.? So yeah, I give them credit for hitting that basic theme, but beyond that, I don't really see that they contributed much.
You mentioned a character before, Igor Danchenko, who was the collector. And, we learned from the Horowitz report, the Justice Department Inspector General, that when he was interviewed by the FBI, he basically sort of walked away from much of what Steele had reported or in the dossier of what he claimed. He described the whole P-tape, blackmail, compromise as just rumor, of which he had no substantiation, yet that is what Steele relied on. Now, what you didn't put in the book, and some folks on the right have made this point, is that there were suspicions by the FBI in the past that this collector, Danchenko, actually had ties himself to Russian intelligence, raising the question as to whether some of what was in the dossier might have been Russian disinformation. Now, you didn't address that in the book. Why not?
Well, I didn't address it through Danchenko because I don't think there is really substantial information to prove that Danchenko was a Russian operative. I certainly addressed the issue of whether there was potentially Russian disinformation that made its way into the Steele dossier. In fact, I describe a scene where, getting back to my colleague Scott Shane, is at the Spy Museum, giving some talk about, the dossier. And he, out of the blue in early 2018, raises the prospect of, well, if it isn't true that Michael Cohen went to Prague, well, how did that get into the dossier? And he hypothesizes that it was Russian disinformation. I mean,
for what purpose? What would have been the Russians, since they wanted to help Donald Trump become president,
right?
Why would they plant information that was of that nature that would only fuel suspicions about Trump's connections to the Kremlin?
Because Scott's theory, which has some valid validity to it, is that they were playing both sides of the fence. Like, if Donald Trump lost, cool. If he won, cool. But they were going to have things out there that made Hillary look bad and made Donald look bad. That was Scott's theory.
Right.
In my point of, what I write about in the book is that there's only two explanations for why that kind of bad information got into the dossier. It was either misinformation or it was shit information. And
what's the difference?
Well, one is just like, I think this happened, and no one's telling you it happened. No one's putting that thought in your head. And it was just like bad information. Again, I come back to the fact that if you had sat down, or any other reporter sat down, and been able to interview Igor Danchenko and heard these stories come out of his own mouth, rather than being dressed up and put into like nice spy prose in Steele's memo, you probably would have asked a few more questions and then gone out and had a meal and forgotten about the whole thing.
Right. But by the way, I mean, the FBI was taking this stuff seriously. I mean, James Comey wanted to put information from the Steele dossier, or about the Steele dossier, in the formal intelligence assessment that then President Obama had requested at the very end. So it's not just journalists, it's the director of the FBI.
Yes, but he was as you know, was in the vast minority when it came to wanting to put information from the Steele dossier. The FBI also misused information from the Steele dossier to seek FISA warrants. And while growing up, I've had developed a very high impression of the FBI, having written 2 books now where FBI plays a role. I'm not overly impressed.
Yes, the FBI is as fallible as the rest of us. We are getting questions from the audience, and I would encourage others. And I think if you go into the chat space on this Zoom call, you could type away. Here's one we got from a name that's, well, I'll leave out the names for, to protect the innocent. What is it about the journalist's media culture versus the author's publishing culture that made Mike, I guess that's me, a believer in Steele's persona and Barry suspicious? Well, that sounds like more a question for me than for you. So, I think I addressed this earlier at the time. For me, the only story was the FBI was investigating some of these allegations and taking them seriously. And to me, that's what crossed the threshold of being a story.
And if I could jump in and
sure,
fill in on the question that, as an author, you do have the advantage of time.
Right.
So where you're looking at your daily deadline, you're racing, I have the advantage of kind of going back and thinking, well, what happened here and how did this happen?
Right. Yeah. And, to be fair to me and a lot of other people, information developed over time. We learned more, and that's, often the case in journalism. We write the first draft, and then we rewrite a second draft as more information comes in. And it was certainly true, by the way, that the FBI wasn't just investigating, as I reported back in the summer or September of 2016. It had actually gone on to get a FISA warrant, a foreign intelligence surveillance warrant, targeting the guy identified in the Steele dossier. So that's a sign for which of how seriously they were taking it. And by the way, it's now become a subject of an ongoing special counsel investigation by one John Durham. We haven't heard much about that lately. What, if anything, can you tell us about what John Durham is up to and whether
I don't
this
have
is
the
going to
I don't
lead
have
to
the
criminal
foggiest
charges?
idea. I have no
sorry.
idea.
Right.
It's not anything that I'm following.
Right. Although it's sort of inextricably interwoven with the subject you're writing about. Right?
I'll wait to see what he has to say.
Yeah. Yes. As will I. Another guy I wanted to ask you about, who looms large in this whole story, is Oleg Deripaska, who is a aluminum magnate, oligarch, very close to Vladimir Putin, and was seen by many in the intelligence and counterintelligence community to be sort of fronting for Putin. Yet he doesn't show up in the Steele dossier at all, does he?
Well, it's a funny coincidence.
Yeah.
Because Christopher Steele, as a private intelligence operative, had clients. And one of his clients for a number of years was Oleg Deripaska. So while you had Christopher Steele campaigning against Russian interference, which I heartily agree with that effort, he was actually working on behalf of a Putin ally. And not only in gathering information for lawsuits, but also effectively lobbying on his behalf with US officials.
Right. And you had come across Deripaska before.
Yes,
you
I
wrote
first
a previous
ran
book about
Missing Man.
Robert Levinson. Tell us
Exactly.
about that.
So when Robert Levinson, a former FBI agent turned private investigator, disappeared in 2007 in Iran, Eventually a hunt was started for him, and the FBI got involved. And since we didn't have good sources in Iran, it started recruiting a bunch of characters, including Russian oligarchs, one of them being Oleg Deripaska. And essentially, Deripaska was on the State Department shit list. They wouldn't allow him into the country, which he desperately wanted to. So he cut a deal with the FBI and basically said, if I help in the search for Deripaska, will you give me a visa? And the FBI agreed to do that, but in time basically blew them off because they didn't think he was really doing anything beneficial.
So, look, this is something that in the course of my reporting, I became increasingly suspicious about. The idea that Steele was working for at least a lawyer for Deripaska, which I guess is a way of working for Deripaska.
That's the way he would work for Deripaska. That's the way operatives work, is through the client's lawyer.
Yeah, which is a whole other issue. I want to flag before we get off this subject. But Deripaska, that struck me at the time, and certainly strikes me more as pretty important piece of information, because it suggested that Steele had business interests that we all should have known about.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Steele, if anything, had business interests, and his business interests might have exceeded his political interests. We know now that he was always trying to hit people up for work. At Brookings, Fiona Hill testified about how he would come sort of, mincing around every once in a while, looking for work. And what I found kind of remarkable is, in the documents that subsequently came out about Christopher Steele, was that he not only worked for Deripaska in pursuing a lawsuit against Paul Manafort and other people, he actually went to the Justice Department on Deripaska's behalf and said, well, Deripaska is like a good guy. He's got like an aluminum smelter in the Ukraine. And do you think like maybe the US government could put in a good word for him? Now, in my book, that's stone cold lobbying. That's stone cold trying to influence the actions of the US government. And the idea that this guy, this former British spy turned spy for hire, would be going and pleading with a US government official to kind of do a favor for Oleg Deripaska is kind of beyond the pale.
Right. But I should point out that this was known to your former colleagues at the New York Times. They wrote about the Deripaska-Steele connection, I think at some point in 2017 or 2018, but they didn't relate it at all to what was in the dossier.
Right. I mean, I think, when Congress issued its report on Russian interference, I think it was the Senate committee issued their report. One of the things that they highlighted was something you had just mentioned, that in all these documents and all these allegations about Russian interference, the name of Oleg Deripaska never appeared. Right. And they were stunned. I mean, they went to great lengths to point out that his name was conspicuously absent from Steele's report. I'm sure Steele has many, good explanations for why that was. Maybe his collector didn't collect information about Deripaska. That's possible. But Deripaska was in the middle of a lot of this.
Right. And also Deripaska had a animus towards Manafort. He was suing Manafort in the Cayman Islands for ripping him off, or allegedly ripping him off, to the tune of $20 million over a Ukrainian cable deal, and that might have been a motivation for Steele to place Manafort at the center of things. On the other hand, Manafort was at the center of a lot. So, it's a mixed bag there. One could have a business interest in sticking it to somebody who deserves to be stuck.
There's no question about that, but it's one thing to say, I'm an opponent of Russian interference, and then go seek the help of US government officials to benefit an ally of Vladimir Putin.
Right. We talked a moment ago about working for lawyers, and that, to me, from a sort of public interest perspective, is something that should probably get more attention here, because what it becomes is a way to conceal who's paying for these private investigators to do this research. When you mentioned my work about Bill Clinton and the 1992 campaign, that was the whole point of what I was. It wasn't just that the Clinton campaign had hired a private detective, Jack Palladino, to dig up dirt on women who might come forward about Bill Clinton. It's that they were hiding it, using, laundering the payments to Palladino through a law firm in Denver, so it never got reported on FEC reports, in which you are supposed to report expenditures by your campaign. Well, and that's something that sort of runs through right to this story, right?
Well, I write about in the book and kind of describe in the book the relationship between private operatives and the client, and it always flows through the lawyer. One, for a legal reason, and that is that the lawyer, and it is the lawyer and the investigator who have a relationship. So if there's ever litigation, none of that material can be protected under what's known as the attorney work product privilege. Right. So they don't ever have to disclose it in court. The second reason is that the investigator, like a Christopher Steele, can say, Oleg Deripaska is not my client. I'm working for his lawyer, which is, sort of like a charade. Because if it wasn't for Oleg Deripaska, his lawyer wouldn't be hiring Christopher Steele.
We have a few more questions from the audience, which are kind of interesting. Do you think that journalists, and in fact the public, are influenced by cinematic fantasies about spies?
I am. I love spy movies.
Right.
I love Homeland.
But is that a part of this? Is that a part of this story?
Well, I mean, certainly in like, why do people become like corporate investigators, spies for hire? I think they very much drink in the fantasy of, as I write, spying on the lives of others. I mean, it's an elixir. There's power that comes from it. There's power that comes from knowing what people don't want you to know, or presenting yourself under a pretext and extracting information from people. So yeah, within kind of the mindset of a private operative, there is very much that image of, wow, I'm a spy and this is cool.
Here's another one. What explains the quality of Steele's research? Sloppy, quick, easy money, or something more sinister?
I don't think it's something more sinister. I mean, he had a very short time frame to put this together. I mean, the idea that he was able to like uncover this vast conspiracy in the space of 4 or 5 weeks, that in and of itself should have alerted people to, raise questions about it. What I found, and what I write about in the book, that, really notable about Steele, and you'll I hopefully agree, Mike, as a journalist, like, if there is critical information coming to us, we really want to like go to the source of it. So if there's an intermediary who's telling me, I've got this person who's telling me this extraordinary stuff, and I want to take it to the bank, I'm going to make it my business to go find that person and to go speak to that person myself. That is something that Christopher Steele never did. He never went out and spoke to the people that Igor Danchenko was getting information from in order to assure himself that that information was reasonable and valid. And
I should point out one other tidbit from your book that is quite significant. Danchenko, the source for all this, never took notes about what he was being told, which, you don't have any notes from sensitive conversations that people are relying on, making, sensational allegations about, public
but if
figures.
he was just, even if he was just the water carrier, and someone is telling him, Michael Cohen went to Prague to meet with Russian agents, that is a piece of information that is so potentially explosive,
right,
that you want to track it down. And he didn't. And, I can't for the life of me imagine either he was lazy or he just decided, this is good enough, let's go with it.
Well, he was, under some pressure to produce
he's a
some
busy
material
guy.
for
He also
his,
had to do work for Oleg Deripaska while all this was going on.
for his business. By the way, the specific allegation in the Steele dossier is that Michael Cohen went to Prague to facilitate the payments to Russian hackers who were hacking the DNC and
whatever,
and
he never went
the
to
Clintonites. But that would have been the definition of collusion, if
right.
there was any truth to that. And
it was the home run.
Yeah, and I will say, I remember questioning, Rachel Maddow, God love her, about this. I mean, I think Rachel Maddow is, a fascinating TV personality, whip smart. I've been friendly with her over the years. She's had me on the show. She helped promote my book. But, she became a big promoter of some of these allegations. And when I had her on my podcast and I questioned her about this and said, and this was sort of later in the game when it was clear that Michael Cohen had not gone to Prague because, he was not charged by that with Mueller's people. I said, well, has it been proven to be untrue? And I guess that's a defense that I've heard over the years about this. Have you proven it to be untrue? Now, I think in this case, it has been proven to be untrue in multiple ways, but that one struck me as, talking about lessons we should all learn from this journalistically, that's not a standard I think you or I would ever accept as grounds for promoting something.
In fact, that's really the troubling thing about what happened here. The idea that something wasn't, the fact that you couldn't prove it wasn't true became the standard for repeating things that apparently weren't true.
Right. And by the way, terrible. I heard Comey do this all the time. He would go on TV when he was promoting his book and get asked about the P-tape and compromat and, does he stand by it? Does he believe it? And he would just say, I don't know if it's true or not. And, for a director of the FBI, that's not a standard to be talking about something. I would think,
well, I'll leave opinions of James Comey to other people.
Okay, one other question here, and then I want to ask you about something else for which you have a great stored house of knowledge. But one more question on this is, another question I have is whether Barry, that's you, feels bitter about having CNN and MSNBC not being willing to admit their mistakes. Is he surprised? And then this person adds, particularly Rachel Maddow.
No, to both questions. I'm not bitter. I'm not surprised. I guess I would welcome a discussion about it, but I don't expect that one is going to happen. I've said what I had to say. People can read the book, people can make what they want out of it. And I feel very good and very comfortable with the information that's in the book and the positions that I've taken in the book.
How do you feel about going on Tucker Carlson tomorrow night?
I feel fine about it in the sense that I am going to say what I want to say. Just the way I would go on Rachel Maddow or
Right.
come on your show and say what I'm going to say. It doesn't really make a difference, the format that I appear in. I'm going to say what I want to say.
Just to round this out, because you've got a stellar track record over the years, and in the introduction, Ariel mentioned you'd written a book about Painkiller, called Painkiller, in which you were, one of, if not the foremost reporter exposing the opioid use by pharmaceutical companies that led to, all the horrible addictions and deaths and suicides we've had as a result of that. There's been a lot out there since then, building on your work. There's this HBO documentary that's been on recently, Crime of the Century. How do you feel about the credit, the degree of credit you've gotten for your groundbreaking work on the opioid crisis?
I feel pretty good about it, to be frank. I've gone from breaking what may have been the one most significant public health stories of our time to being a character in Patrick Reed and Keith's recent book about the Sackler. It's called Empire of Pain. And look, I'm old. My journalism career is kind of winding down. And if one of the legacies I leave is as the guy who broke the story about the opioid crisis and Big Pharma's role in creating it, I'll be very happy.
Right. And just sort of one more beat on that, as you have watched the investigations unfold, the lawsuits, and everything else that has flowed from this. Has justice been done in this case?
I don't believe so. I mean, I broke a story several years ago, right before I left the Times, about how the Justice Department wanted to charge senior executives of Purdue with felony crimes that would have sent them to jail. I got possession of this document showing all the evidence that the prosecutors plan to present to a grand jury to seek those charges. It was quashed by the Justice Department. And the mere act of that not only allowed the arc of the opioid epidemic to continue, but intensified it, because it let other producers know that ultimately the only real price to be paid here was money. No one was going to go to jail. No one was going to face serious consequences. And that, unfortunately, is how this story has played out. It's a really sad testament to our justice system and to our need to extract serious accountability from corporate bad actors, and not just the company, but the individuals who profited and oversaw those activities.
Well, I think a lot of people will agree with you on that score, and no question, you've done like truly groundbreaking work on that area. So I think we seem to have exhausted our questions, and we've covered it. I think the subjects I want to cover. Is there anything else you'd like to say, or you'd like people to know about your book before we end this?
Well, all I'd like to say is, if you'd like to read about what I consider to be the spy story of our time, I'd recommend my book, because what it really tells the story of this booming industry of private spies and how they're invading our privacy, profiting from deception, and manipulating the media. Beyond that, thanks so much for hosting me and participating in this. And thank you, Ariel, and everybody else at the Montclair Library for putting this on.
Well, thank you, Barry, so much for coming. And you too, Mike. What an illuminating and somewhat disturbing conversation. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today, because as I always say, without you, we're nothing. Spooked and Barry and Mike's other books are available for sale by our partner, Watch on Booksellers, and they're also available to borrow through the Montclair Public Library. And so this is the point where I always tell everybody, if you want to support our authors, buy their books. If you want them to come back to Open Book, Open Mind, buy their books. If you believe in a free press and you want to support people who are doing the hard work of real investigation, buy their books. It's as simple as that. And the ultimate compliment to an author is to want to own their books. As a librarian, I often am just happy to have them in the library. When I really love a book, I want to own it. So finally, we hope that you'll consider coming back for our fall season, which starts off on Thursday, September 9th, with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Lawrence Wright talking about his new book, The Plague Year, Americans in the Time of COVID. We'll also be featuring Mary Roach, Alice Hoffman, and contributors to the 1619 Project next season. So in the meantime, be well. Have a great summer. Keep reading. Thanks for coming.
Okay.
Bye for now.